Hello and welcome to Minter Dialogue, episode number 513. My name is Minter Dial and I'm your host for this podcast, a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. For more information or to check out other shows on this network, please visit evergreenpodcasts.com. So this week's interview is with my old friend Josh Shelov. Josh is an Emmy award-winning filmmaker who has written, directed and produced feature-length films, documentaries and shorts, including directing for ESPN 30 for 30. Among his portfolio, I must say, is my own film, The Last Ring Home. After 25 years of making films in Hollywood, Josh turned his attention to spreading the pleasure of writing. He founded and is CEO of Written Out Loud, designed to give creative kids the same team and community-oriented validation that young athletes receive. In this chat with Josh, we discuss his career, lessons learned, and the power of storytelling. We also delve into his tremendous work at Written Out Loud, as well as reflect back on the film we made together. You'll find all the show notes on minterdial.com, and please do consider to drop in a little rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe to catch all the future episodes. Now for the show. Well, who'd have thought? Josh Shelov, after all these years, getting you on my show. Gosh, where to start? But I'm going to start with you, asking you, who is Josh Shelov today?
Oh, my goodness. What a question. Well, let me begin by saying how honored I am to be not just a part of this series that you've created and your podcast, but of your life and journey. It's been one of the most rewarding relationships of my entire life without any hyperbole at all. So thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for that, Josh. We're going to get into some of that woo stuff, but so how'd you like to describe yourself?
Yeah, okay, exactly. All right, now I'll talk about myself, I suppose. I think of myself as a storyteller, first and foremost, and perhaps the sibling of that is now as a teacher of storytelling. I became, I would say, consciously obsessed with storytelling during my time as a filmmaker. And I'm still a filmmaker, although perhaps with a smaller percentage of my overall bandwidth. The larger percentage of my time is now spent teaching the craft of storytelling, primarily to kids, but also to adults as well.
Sweet. Well, I want to get into that and how stories beget stories. But I would love for you, Josh, to lay down how we met, because I've known my side of the story, and I have said it, gosh, how many times, I don't know, but I fear that I'm way off. So I would love to hear you say how we met. And then people who know both sides of the stories will be able to judge how my story has evolved over time.
Yeah, it would be amazing if we were, close to each other's version of the story. Although knowing both of us, neither one of us would let the truth get in the way of best possible.
Exactly.
As they say, print the legend. So my memory goes a little something like this. I had the enormous honor and great pleasure of meeting your father first. So, your father, the estimable Victor Dial, and I were on a Yale alumni chorus tour of Europe and Russia in 1999, 2000. It was one of those years. I believe it was 1999. But let's see. Immediately, as he does on so many people, your father, Victor Dial, struck me as just an incredible man, and a man I would be fortunate enough to have a conversation with, let alone become friends with. And we began chatting, somewhere either in Russia or in England, where this tour was wonderful enough to take us. And fairly soon after that, your father began telling the story about his father, Minter Dial, the senior. And as he told me the story, I was completely blown away, as one would be. And then he said, you really have to talk to is my son, who is, of course, named after Minter, my father. And so we made a plan for me to find you once we returned to the US. I can't exactly say now how much back and forth there was. Again, maybe we were on tour in 99, maybe in 2000, but what I certainly remember is that the date that we set to finally have our face-to-face meeting in New York City was September 11th, 2001. And so we woke up on that day in one world, and by 9:30 we were living in a different world. And it was such was the immediate trauma of the moment. And I was in that, by the way, for what it's worth, I was in Midtown. I was on 34th and 10th. My wife was fortunately safely off of the island of Manhattan, and I had no children. My wife was pregnant with our first child on September 11th, 2001. So she was safe. I was safe in Midtown, although obviously we didn't feel very safe. We had no idea if the Empire State Building, which loomed over my head, was next. But in the days of that moment, with literally like ash cascading through the air, at some point I realized that I had a standing appointment to meet you. And we chose to keep that appointment. And Minter, you tell me, maybe it was because we couldn't get in touch with each other because the cell phones were out, or whatever it was, but we chose to meet each other face to face that day. And I remember walking down the sidewalks of Midtown Manhattan and seeing people covered with ash and all of the things that those of us who were in Manhattan were seeing. And again, for me to simply be, a mile or two north of Ground Zero was dramatic. The difference between, being at Ground Zero and being in Midtown was night and day, even though, like I said, that you did see the ash literally falling through the air. And so I can't remember the name of the place that we actually met. Do you remember where?
Well, I think it was an Irish pub. That's what I recall, because I remember drinking a few Guinness.
Yes, that's definitely correct. And then I remember we sat down, and you had a pretty serious like package of notes with you, and all of the correspondences and histories that you had been building up over the years as you had been, pivoting into making the synthesizing and distribution of this story into such a big chapter of your life. And of course, you and I then created a bond that would then go on for some 16 years while we talked about ultimately making the movie together that we ultimately ended up making. Yeah,
that corresponds. Yeah, totally. And the fact is that between that day, the 11th of September 2001, and the premiere of the film in November 2016 on PBS, there was a gap.
Yeah, that's right.
And so I'm wondering what on earth stimulated, because in the end of the day, what happens is that this is my narrative, you reappear in my life. We might have exchanged. I changed countries a few times, but then all of a sudden you get this idea to just say, hey, Minter, it's Josh. Do you remember writing that message?
So that's foggy. I mean, certainly you're right. We're talking about, 15 or 16 years. And I would say that the larger chapters of the arc between our first meeting and ultimately the resumption of our contact that ended up actually getting the film off the ground, I had a few key chapters in my life in between. So 2001, we meet.
At that time, you're just leaving university. You're a young man going into the world, thinking film, not sure. You're sort of looking for life still. I mean, obviously, you're a young man.
Yes, and that's a kind way of putting the fact that I had basically had no success whatsoever as a filmmaker until the very next year. The very next year was a transformative one for me, in which I finally sold my first screenplay.
Yay.
Certainly not the first screenplay that I had ever written. It was about the fourth or the fifth, but it had been, years of hard labor, me trying to figure it out. And so in 2002, I wrote the film that would become Green Street Hooligans, starring Elijah Wood. You're a Man of Europe. It's a little bit of a bigger film in Europe than it is in the US, but there are, it has its fans in the US as well. And that changed my whole life and allowed me to then move to Hollywood and begin really working with some extraordinary professional storytellers and filmmakers as a screenwriter, basically throughout my 30s. So that takes me up until roughly the 2010s, at which point I started pivoting into documentary work. My reasons for doing so were largely fueled by stability. So at that time, now in the 2010s, I had 3 kids, and I was looking for a way to continue to tell stories while having a little bit more just sort of ballast and consistency in my life as a father. And I was very lucky to be hired by an extraordinary woman who has unfortunately since passed. But she hired me in 2014 and basically put me to work as kind of a senior documentary producer inside her shop. And what I found, essentially as a full-time, documentarian, was that the principles of storytelling that I had been working on so assiduously on the fiction side were precisely the same on the nonfiction side. And so it was in her shop that I started to be able to make documentaries that actually got a good bit of distribution, such as several ESPN 30 for 30 documentaries that I got to make during that time. And it was when I felt I had my legs under me as a documentarian that I then reached back out to you and I said, maybe now, 15, 16 years hence, we can actually really make this film in the way that it deserves to be made.
Fabulous. I like that arc, Josh. So you were just saying storytelling. It's exactly the same in fiction as it is in nonfiction. At some level, I want to say duh, but of course, I also want to say what?
Mm.
I remember having the opportunity to be on the same stage as Ken Loach, the amazing filmmaker who won Cannes d'Or and many other films he did. I, Daniel Blake. So he's a very well-known fiction filmmaker. And his specific angle or way he does things is he likes to do one cut. And as such, I felt as I was listening to him that it was actually very similar to making a documentary. Because when you make one cut, you can't sort of airbrush stuff out. You can't, oh, I heard the airplane. Well, the airplane was there. There's an authenticity and a rigorous reality to the way he shoots his films. And so that was my first aha. You mean fiction and nonfiction can share a similarity? I mean, at the end of the day, storytelling in film can serve an enormous purpose other than just entertainment.
Absolutely. Oh yeah.
How would you describe that?
Wow. Okay. So let me take the second part first. Storytelling is serving a purpose greater than just entertainment. You may have seen at some point Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
Right. So at one pinnacle of this triangle, the hierarchy of needs that we need as animals, as human beings, food, shelter, oxygen, the things that we need in order to literally not die on a given day. So that's the absolute pinnacle. But not far behind that is our need for belonging, for love and community. And these are not things that would be nice to have. Entertainment, I think, is a nice thing to have. But our need for belonging and love and community, I believe, although it sits just behind food and shelter and oxygen, it doesn't sit far behind. And if you look at the ways that, just say hypothetically, the ways that children around the world are, and we use the term binging these days, watching story after story after story after story. It's not because they are addicted to something, in my opinion, any more than they're addicted to food or oxygen or shelter. People need stories as a means to generate belonging and love and community in their lives. We need each other. And I believe story to be the healthiest expression of our need for each other. Just that simple. If you think of the healthiest expression of our need for shelter as a home, and the healthiest expression of our need for food as a home-cooked meal, I think the healthiest expression of our need for each other is a story. And ideally, of course, a homespun one that's told live between two people. But of course, films and books and musicals and plays and storytelling of all kinds fulfills this need, which is why we seek it out, and which is why I believe it to be so much more fundamental than quote unquote mere entertainment. That resonate?
Totally. My friend Charlie Gladstone, he goes in the same vein. In his recent book, he wrote, art is as important as oxygen. So he's kind of closer to the singular, the lowest part of the chain that Maslow had identified. So storytelling allows us to relate to one another. In the stories that are told, there then must be some responsibility in the filmmaker, because there are things like ethics and the impact that a film has. And I wonder to what extent that conversation is or isn't, has or hasn't been part of the way fiction, Hollywood type films has been going. How does that make you think?
That's interesting. There are some, now that I'm in the teaching of storytelling business, and forgive the plug, but the name of our storytelling program and company is Written Out Loud. But at Written Out Loud, we talk quite a bit about the values of storytelling that really matter to us. And this is where it can get quite subjective. But nonetheless, I'm not a huge proponent of the two terms that you just used, which are responsibility and ethics. And this is not to say that I don't believe in them in some regard or another. It's simply the way in which we practice the craft of storytelling and teach others to practice the craft of storytelling. So we believe in storytelling as being inclusive, which is to say, we're telling a story, you and I, right now, in a way that we wish to include each other.
Mm-hmm.
And in so doing, radiate that inclusivity out to the audience that is experiencing the story.
Right. We're not combative,
precisely
fighting. Yeah.
That's right. Exactly. Now, am I ethically obligated to do such a thing? Is it my responsibility to do that? I don't know. I don't feel that quite as fundamentally, if you know what I'm saying. I believe very much in exercising this need to connect, to create belonging, to find love, to find community and compassion among my fellow people. There's almost a rectitude around the idea of responsibility or ethics that I think is a bit of an ill fit when it comes to storytelling as I perceive it. And again, this is quite subjective. I preface all of this by saying how subjective this is. There are a couple of other very, very common storytelling tropes out there, such as theme, that I've never really been just a huge proponent of either. So I think of storytelling as, again, from a personal standpoint, as being very redolent of certain values. And then there are other values that aren't quite as important to me. And responsibility and ethics to me are two things that I don't think much about. And this does not mean that I don't value the importance as they belong to others.
Well, the reason why I bring this up, and it sort of flits back into the business world, where storytelling is all the rage, and how brands should storytell, and you're telling stories. Well, that's what a parent might say to a kid who's lying, and so that's viewed poo-pooed. And then we have the issue of, well, you got to make money. So if I tell a great story, and like we said at the beginning, we don't let truth get in the way of a good story, well, we're sort of fibbing around the edges in order to make the story tell. And if the opportunity lies within the story to help people associate and communicate and commune around the story, well, isn't there some sort of friction between the need to make money and that opportunity, if not responsibility, to help people foster community and make relationships and bond over a classic story?
Yes. The short answer, yes, I agree. And it's a very interesting terrain. I also work with brands, and I work with companies as well. And I do find that there can and often is great harmony between storytelling as conducted by businesses and business people, and storytelling as we teach a 9-year-old to do, to write a story or a book that is just completely quote unquote for themselves, a keepsake that they might pin to their refrigerator or print a copy of at the end of it. The point is that in the business world, certain companies provide a product or a service that benefits the customer. And I think that those companies that are out there, and I would imagine that all of them at least perceive themselves to be beneficial to their customer, are in their marketing telling the story of that benefit. They're telling the story of, here's how you, customer, can go on a journey through our product and service that will benefit your own life, benefit those of your loved ones, benefit your community, right? So, let's just take, I don't know, I'm going to say Starbucks, just off the top of my head, right? To be alert in your work is a good thing. That's a positive value, right? To be feeling good as you walk in the door, that is something that Starbucks helps you achieve, right? I feel that every morning. I don't necessarily get Starbucks every morning personally, but there have been many days in which I have, and there have been countless numbers of people who feel better about themselves, feel more alert, feel more attentive, maybe even feel more generous towards others as they've had a Starbucks. Which is to say, Starbucks is doing good in the world insofar as it provides a benefit for their customers. That's a good story to tell. And that customer journey is one that serves not only the customer, but Starbucks themselves. There's like Adam Smith stuff that we can get into here, right? Like Adam Smith really believed that the good business can both grow and benefit the community at the same time. The more revenue comes in, the more people we can hire. The more people we can hire, the more we help the community. That helps us grow our revenue even more, and it's a beneficial cycle. Now, of course, obviously, if ultimately the business owners are putting more into their own pocket at the expense of the customer's journey, then we get into areas of greed that are not uncommon, et cetera. But I do believe in the harmonious Venn diagram intersection of storytelling and business.
Yeah, storytelling and profit. And who would I be to not talk about that? The story I tell about Starbucks is it's a safe place to meet in any city.
Absolutely. Yeah. The third space, right? That is, I think, an absolute benefit as well. All kinds of folks out there, obviously, who can't necessarily afford an office, meeting in a Starbucks, having a productive business meeting on their way to maybe being able to afford an office, or maybe that's actually their office. Hugely, hugely common. Starbucks is aware of this. And that's a benefit that their business provides.
Imagine how fast we could solve the world's biggest problems if more SaaS startups would gain traction sooner. Welcome to the Tech Entrepreneur on a Mission podcast. This podcast is dedicated to sharing experiences from B2B SaaS CEOs who are going above and beyond to deliver change that is noticed. You will hear their secrets and learn what is required to build a SaaS business that the world starts talking about and keeps talking about, and how to overcome the roadblocks to do so.
All right. So before we get into the work you're doing at Written Out Loud, I do want to just zero in on this idea. You moved from Hollywood back to New York. You're doing documentary, and I was captured by this thought that you wanted more stability in documentary. And as I know, anyway, you don't make a ton of money in documentary. But I was thinking it sounded like it's sort of like one-hit wonders, or massive possibilities that can be high delta when it comes to fiction. You can make lots or make nothing and wait years because it's sort of unpredictable in that respect. On the other hand, the documentary side, you're not going to win millions, but there's more predictability. There's also this other notion that within documentaries, although you might correct me, within stories in general, there's a seeking of truth.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I believe it. I also believe there's a seeking of truth in fiction storytelling, by the way. Slightly
I was
different.
imagining. Yeah.
But yeah, there's a very strong relationship between honesty and storytelling. And we could do an hour and a half on just that collision right there. To tackle the piece about stability first, if I had been alone making documentary after documentary, you know this life very well, Minter. It's very feast or famine. It's very boom and bust. But at this time in my life, I was fortunate enough to be hired by a company that not only produced documentaries, but they produced big award shows. This was a well-established company, particularly in the world of sports media. And sports media is a great place to be if you're making documentaries, because they require the production of not just continuous content, but repeatable content. And so I was involved in the production of the ESPY Awards for ESPN, the NFL Honors, which honors the best in the NFL in a given year. And see, these are wonderful pieces of recurring work that basically can provide stability as documentaries such as The Last Ring Home come and go. The documentaries that I made for the 30 for 30 series, I ended up making 3 30 for 30 documentaries while I was at that company. But those pieces are, as you were describing, one of ones. And so it's quite difficult, perhaps arguably as difficult as it is to make fictional stories. It's very, very hard to make that a recurring source of revenue and source of stability. And I would not have had it were it not for those big, award shows and those perennials, as it were, that were part of that.
Right. So you've made TV series, big screen films, and short films. The We Are film. I saw the trailer for that, and I thought that was really interesting. I highly recommend anybody check that out. We Are. It spoke to me in every way. The title We Are was really, I thought, brilliant. And then you have launched this new project. Well, at least I call it new because for anyone listening, it'll be new to them. writtenoutloud.org. And obviously what you're doing there's an element of giving back. Tell us how the idea came around.
Of Written Out Loud.
Yeah.
It went hand in hand with the filmmaking process, which is to say it very much grew out of my fiction and documentary production careers. It was essentially what I think of as the most valuable thing that I've ever learned along the way. So as I finally, after 10 years of trying, became a Hollywood screenwriter, followed by becoming a fairly productive documentarian, the most important thing that I learned along the way was the power and value of telling one story out loud. So whether I was making screenplays and films in Hollywood or making documentaries, the essential spinal cord of any project was the out loud campfire version of the story. So you, Minter, of course, have sat down with many, many people and told the story of your grandfather. And you know what happens when you tell that story out loud. The people that you are telling the story to forget that they're alive, and they enter the world of your story. And that's a combination of a couple of things. Number one, of course, the underlying facts of your grandfather's story are remarkable. But number two, you are a craftsman. And you have, through repetition and passion and care and craft, turned your grandfather's life into a, let's just say, 5-minute story that you can tell in a bar, 10-minute story that you can tell into a bar. And when you tell that story out loud to other people, you are connecting with the old craft, the stuff that connects us with our ancestors and our descendants.
Campfire stuff.
Exactly right. This is the real magic. This is really, really the closest thing to a magic trick that I have discovered in my whole life. There is not a single movie or television show in Hollywood that does not begin with that same process. Hey, Josh, you got an idea for a movie? They don't say, write it up. They say, come in, go into the offices of Warner Brothers, go into the offices of Sony. They hand you a bottle of water. They sit down, they put their phone aside, and all they want is for you to tell them a story that gets them to forget that they're alive for the next 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes. Because that's the stuff that can truly be adapted and disseminated into any form of media that there is. And not just movies and TV shows, but business ideas, a user experience in the world of technology. If you can take people on that unconscious journey of leaving their quote unquote ordinary world, to talk about the Joseph Campbell of it all, crossing the threshold into some new and special world and transforming themselves through that journey into a new and better version of themselves, you can do whatever you want.
Let me just
go ahead.
interrupt. I want to break in with how important is the title or the look, the first impression, before I even get into the first words that come out of my mouth. So in order to get into that room with a bottle of water to tell your story, they got to know who Josh Shelov is. And what's he got? He's got a story. What's it called? Those other little filters that can quickly just be brushed off. And then the second part is, well, you got your first line, your opening gambit. And how much is that important to the success of a story? Can you do the slow burn version? Riff on that.
Yeah, the way that you get into the room where it happens, as they say in Hamilton, is definitely a chicken and egg conundrum. I don't have any answers for those who are like, yes, of course, if I could only get into the room with the Warner Brothers executives, then I too could tell them a story that gets them to forget that they're alive. You're probably right. It took me 12 years and a lot of good luck in order to get in there. And it was only, of course, ironically, but this is true, we know of life, when I had become a made guy, when I had an agent and when I had a manager, then and only then could I be the new kid on the block. So there is unquestionably an enormous amount of jujitsuing and fighting and indefatigable effort and failure and effort and failure and effort and failure to win over that first person that can create the domino effect of ultimately getting the reputation necessary to tell the stories to those who are in positions of power. So it took me a long time, and I was a pretty wily and connected guy. I was coming out of Yale. I was coming out of a pretty good position in sports media. I wasn't coming from whatever the wilds of Antarctica. It nonetheless took me a long time and an enormous amount of failure and repetition and repeating that same cycle in order to get in front of people. So that I don't have any answers other than persistence to get to the point of telling your story to the kind of studio influencers that can make Hollywood movies, etc.
All right, so now the door is opened, you're sitting down, and the first line. How critical? I mean, is it just sine qua non, the opening piece to getting that story rip?
I've got an answer. To me, the opening line, although it's always good to have a good opening line for sure. The opening moment, to me, that is the key, is it surrounds a principle that we refer to at Written Out Loud as the skin jump. The skin jump is what you wish as a storyteller to achieve. You wish your listener to leave their own skin and enter the skin of your protagonist, your main character. Because, as we spoke about earlier, you want your listener to forget that they're alive. They do so by, through the magical pathway of empathy, leaving their own world behind and entering the world of the story that you are creating. They do so by feeling the vulnerability of your main character. So, to take the example of your grandfather, Minter Dial, if I were to simply tell his story chronologically, and by the way, if anyone is listening who does not know the story of Minter's grandfather, the great Minter Dial, watch, read, experience The Last Ring Home. It's an amazing story. But essentially, of course, it is the story of a soldier, a young soldier who leaves the Naval Academy, and as a young man is put in charge of a tugboat, sails across the Pacific at the beginning of the war, World War II, and finds himself captured by the Japanese and put in one of these hellacious prison camp scenarios that have been dramatized in ways that are now familiar, and ways in which many who live still were able to survive. Now, as a storyteller, what I have done is I have described the circumstances of a character who is vulnerable. Now, what have I done to my listener by doing that? I have gotten them to empathize with your grandfather. They leave their own world behind, and now they have entered the skin of this poor and desperate man who is now a prisoner of war in the South Pacific. You create that vulnerability, and now you have your audience with you on your journey. So more so than an opening line per se, it's that skin jump moment at the beginning of a story that allows you to bring the audience, the listener, with you on the course of the journey and give them that transformation that they're seeking.
Love it. All the more so that, of course, the story of empathy, or the concept of empathy, is obviously one of my hot topics. And I frequently talk about the importance of reading fiction and seeing well-made stories, because that allows you to move from who you are into the skin of who they are, and possibly gain other perspectives, diversity of experiences being the key there.
Exactly.
So Written Out Loud, what you come at it from experience, you want to, let's say, give back.
Exactly.
You also
I'm sorry.
You want to make storytelling more accessible, is how I kind of read about it. Tell us about your project, what you're doing, and
Thank you.
You're
Yeah,
up to.
you gave me the opportunity to plug my company, and instead I ended up on a bit of a tangent. But we were talking about a principle of story.
Hey, that's storytelling. We're going in and out. Hey,
Yeah,
but I'll bring you back. You did that to me. I'm going to bring you back.
There you go. Thank you. So Written Out Loud was the direct outgrowth of me beginning to see and recognize and value this craft of out loud storytelling. I saw that it was basically a fundamental, foundational principle in Hollywood. I saw that it had changed my own life and made me think about myself as a writer. Instead, I began to think, well, why did no one ever teach me this when I was younger? I could have gotten to where I wanted to go so much more quickly. And so then combined that with being a father, and I said, boy, I've got to start teaching this to kids, because I think I see something inside Hollywood that so few people get to actually see and understand. So what I began doing essentially was, so you know, of course, the story of Apple Computer. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak did not invent the computer. The computer had been a private product that was used only by academia, intellectuals, the elite of the elite inside Stanford and University of Texas and so on. All they did was basically repurpose it as a consumer product. They said one of these should be in every home, and he made it beautiful and accessible. What I've done with Written Out Loud is I've basically taken the concept of a Hollywood writer's room. Now, you know, Minter, that the Hollywood writer's room is basically 4 to 8 people sitting around a table creating a single television show. And they use, as their writing tools, as much as they use their fingers and the text format, they use their voices. They use their ears, they use their empathy. They use their heart and their desire to connect. They synthesize a single story together, and only after they have achieved a sense of synergy and harmony out loud, then and only then do they use their skills at the keyboard to type out essentially a transcription of their synergy. So the first thing that they do is they fight and they bite and they claw and they scratch in order to achieve that shared story out loud. Then they go and write their individual chapters by themselves, which we call episodes. All that we've done at Written Out Loud is basically taken that same concept and repositioned it as a program for kids. So kids across the country and around the world almost uniformly dislike writing. They can't stand the way that writing is taught to them in schools. And so most kids, they actually, two-thirds of US K through 12 kids are writing below their grade level. And in fact, they think of writing as some kind of punishment. Now, I'm hopeful that your kids, I'm sure they were in great schools and they found great teachers and found a way to enjoy writing. But as a general matter, kids really don't like writing. I believe that it's because of how writing is taught. It's not because the craft of writing is inherently punishing. On the contrary, I think it's one of the most enjoyable crafts that I've ever been able to discover and practice. But when you give kids a team, when you say you and these 4 other kids are going to write this story together, number 1. Number 2, you're going to write it out loud with your voices and your ears and your heart and your empathy, every bit as much, if not more so, than with your fingers in the text-based format, which will be an aftermath of that team-based out loud process. And then the third thing that we do that totally inverts what they do in schools is we let kids become inspired and imitate the stories that they actually love. The stories they know by heart, like Harry Potter, Star Wars, Marvel, etc. It's so easy and joyful to imitate the stories that we already know. We love them. Of course I can imitate a Spider-Man story. Of course I can imitate a Harry Potter story. The internet is filled with fan fiction. And we're not that far apart from the idea of fan fiction at Written Out Loud. In fact, what we say is that there's no such thing as originality. Everyone is borrowing from somewhere else. It's not where you take things from, it's where you take them to. And so those 3 ideas, as a team, out loud, inspired by the stories that you love, that's at the heart of Written Out Loud. And now we are providing our program to kids across the country and schools across the country who are struggling with how to get kids to fall in love with writing.
First, an anecdote and a question. The anecdote, I was talking with somebody else, a senior, let's say over 60, and we were talking about how he works with senior teams and did an exercise where he invited a bunch of 60-year-olds to put on a mask, like a Venetian mask. And he was remarking how easy it was for them to don and then adopt the personality of the mask as if that was them. And it struck me that was like just bringing the kid out of them. And that is something that we as adults tend to completely strip away. We stick with our masks and the things we're supposed to say and the things we're supposed to do. And that juvenility is driven right out of us. The question, meanwhile, is with regard to Written Out Loud, which, by the way, I loved your description. It was not at all apparent to me the notion of writing out loud. I hadn't sort of cottoned on to this notion. I was thinking more read out loud, but the notion of
explanation. It's a very new approach, although it's obviously happening in Hollywood writers' rooms. As a consumer product, it's still very new. This is what I do all day. I explain written out loud to.
Well, thank goodness, and you do it well. And but so what's the business model? I mean, you're .org, so it's not for profit, I presume. But how do you who buys what sells?
We have a hybrid for-profit and not-for-profit structure. And basically we were launched as a for-profit, but then the demand from various markets and partners who wanted the not-for-profit version of written out loud to exist essentially necessitated that we create this hybrid structure.
I see.
So we essentially partner with paying customers on the for-profit side. Often we call this our family business. So, if you wanted to put your 11-year-old in the program, your 11-year-old could then join us either after school or in the summer as a summer camp. And we would group your 11-year-old with her kindred spirits across the country and soon around the world who also love what she loves, who loves Harry Potter, who loves the Hunger Games, etc. And together, and this is obviously, the silver lining of the pandemic, we can create groups of kindred spirits regardless of geography. So we can. So
this is online.
This is all online, exactly. This is basically stitched together via Zoom and Google Docs until we build our own platform, hopefully in the near future. But essentially, we create what we call a creative crew. And a creative crew is 4 to 6 kids working together after school and in the summertime, and they write a book together. The not-for-profit side tends to be partnerships with cities and with schools who, serve shall we say, communities with like free and reduced lunches, et cetera, who can't afford to pay for our program on the family basis. That is very often paid for using federal grant money, educational grant money, state, city, et cetera. Often, it's individual benefactors who have come in and said, look, I want every single 8th grader in this school to graduate as a published author. Every single person who graduates written out loud, whether they are on the for-profit side or the not-for-profit side, everyone co-authors a book. You're probably listening to this, but if you could see it, I'm showing Minter Dial copies of the books that Written Out Loud actually publishes. And every single one of these books is co-authored by a group of 4 to 6 kids working together in the methodology that I just described. So essentially, those are our 2 revenue streams. It's families who are basically buying the program for their kids and grandkids on the one side, and then grants, schools, districts, and organizations who are, basically buying for lower income students and storytellers, as we call them on the other.
Wow. So if I'm a parent and I'm living in London or Europe, are there ways? Are you European friendly in terms of hours for stitching gangs together?
We're getting there. So I would definitely recommend that you get in touch with us if you're in London and you're listening. We have had remarkable storytellers from London in our program, just not very many of them. Most of our user base, most of our customers are in the 4 US time zones, which I include Canada. We've had a terrific number of Canadian storytellers and kids through our program, many of whom have become multiple time novelists in our program. The storytellers that have come out of jolly old England, not surprisingly, have been extraordinary and written some of the best books in the history of our program. We certainly expect to be a thriving business in Europe in the coming months and years. It is a very big part of our plans. There's nothing about our business, Minter, of course, that is the slightest bit biased towards the US. Anywhere on earth that values storytelling is going to value this methodology. Chinese American families and Indian American families are among our biggest consumers and customers. Any family that prizes literacy can turn their kids into a published author using this methodology. Just give us a ring, writtenoutloud.org, and I'm confident we can find a way to work with you, either with your children or with your school, as we grow with more and more schools and organizations.
I just love it, Josh.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful for the opportunity, not just to talk about my company, of course, but to have such an elevated dialogue with you, my old friend. I'm so grateful and proud of you for everything that you've been doing.
And what way would you like people to follow you, get in touch with you? Do you have any particular preferred ways?
I'm on Twitter at Shelov J. Shelov is spelled Shelov. J is my first initial. Written Out Loud has its own social channels as well, and there is more and more good storytelling. We shy away from the term content. We say good storytelling is coming out of Written Out Loud with greater and greater frequencies, including the blog that I write and some of the stories that the kids are writing and publishing now every day. So writtenoutloud.org, our social channels are across Facebook and Instagram, and Twitter and LinkedIn as well. And then my personal Twitter is Shelov J. Thanks for the opportunity.
Hey, it's been lovely. Go reach out, guys. Get your children onto this program. I love it. Thanks for having listened to this episode of the Minter Dialogue podcast. If you like the show and would like to support me, please consider a donation on patreon.com/MinterDial. You can also subscribe on your favorite podcast service. And as ever, rating and reviews are the real currency for podcasts. You'll find the show notes with over 2,000 and more blog posts on minterdial.com. Check out my documentary film and 4 books, including my last one, You Lead, How Being Yourself Makes You a Better Leader. And to finish, here's a song I wrote with Stephanie Singer, A Convinced Man.
A stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger to feel free. Trust is the reason, still I won't toe the line. I sit here passively, hope for your respect, anticipating the thrill of your intellect. Maybe I tell myself there's no use in me lying. I'm a convinced man, building an urge. I'm a convinced man, to live and die submerged. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, challenge my fate. I'm a convinced man, competition's innate. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. Despise revenges and struggle with deceit. Live for the challenge so life's not incomplete. What's wrong with challenge? I know soon we all die. I like the feel of a stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger to feel free. Trust in my reason and let me show you why. I'm a convinced man, practicing my lines. I'm a convinced man, here in these confines. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, put to the test. I'm a convinced man, I'm ready for an arrest. I'm a convinced man, in the arms of a woman.
Hey podcast listeners, my name is Paul O'Connor and I'm the host of the Rust Belt Rundown, a show that highlights valuable insights from manufacturing executives and business leaders in Northeast Ohio and beyond. We convene these leaders for candid discussions about business, regional happenings, industry trends, entrepreneurship, and more. With a wide range of guests and topics, there is something for everyone. Listen to Rust Belt Rundown for free on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app.